Today we're going to be talking about the humanistic tradition in transformative coaching. We have an hour together, got plenty to get through, so I'm going to go crack straight on with it. And perhaps start off by introducing myself. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Nick Bolton. I'm the founder of Animas Center for Coaching and the International Center for Coaching Supervision. And I guess I'm on a journey to really understand what's at the heart of the practice that we call transformative coaching. And for many years, we called it transformational coaching. And quite happily did so. And I started to realize that there was a kind of a weakening of that word transformational. People would go on like a yoga retreat and come back and call themselves a yoga coach. Call themselves a transformational coach, which is fine. I've got no problem with what people call themselves, but it started to make me think, well, how do I distinguish what we stand for and what sits behind Animas? And so I went on a bit of a journey to think about transformative coaching, which comes from a much stronger theoretical background. And this whole lecture series is a part of that journey towards really deepening our understanding of what transformative coaching is and what are the theoretical roots that sit behind it and also the practices that surround it. So I'm going to be sharing a screen in a second. Let me just get my screen share up. By the way, I always love seeing all your faces. It's such a pleasure to see you all. Familiar faces too as well, because I see so many of you from Coaches Uncaged, so it's really great to see you. Let me just share my screen here. Everybody seeing this, just give me a little thumbs up if you would. Yeah, great, excellent. All right, so here we are, the humanistic tradition in transformative coaching, and we'll be, as I said, we'll be taking about an hour together. Hopefully got a bit of time for Q&A at the end, but there's quite a bit to get through, because the more I delved into this in terms of really, because it's funny how we think we understand something until we really start to look at it and then say, well, hold on, do I actually agree with that? Do I actually resonate with that? So this is very much a personal perspective on the humanistic tradition. First of all, I want to cover some of the basic facts. What are its origins? And what are its essential assumptions that we really recognize as being key within humanistic psychology, but also how it feeds into coaching. And then we'll take a look at its specific role in transformative coaching. What are the aspects of it that really lead to transformative work? And we'll take a look at what I would call the dangers of wholesale introjection of the humanistic psychological approach. Some of what I might call inherent dangers, or the challenges, maybe not dangers, but the challenges of introjecting, and that is to say, wholly taking in the concepts without really chewing on them and digesting them and thinking which bits really work and which bits don't. And then I want to talk about the critiques of the tradition, and there are certainly plenty of critiques, some coming from me and some coming from other thinkers. I want to share what those critiques are, and then finally share my hopes for the humanistic tradition in coaching as we go forward over the next 10, 20, 30 years. So quite a long time span. So let's dive in. I want to quickly reflect again on where this sits within our principles of transformative coaching, the 5 Animas principles of transformative coaching. And if you were at the last lecture, you'll remember that the very, very heart of the Animas model is the phenomenological principle. That's to say, the centrality of the human experience of the client, not of the coach, not of the world, not of anyone else, of the client. That's at the absolute heart of the Animas model of transformative work. And then surrounding that are the 3 layers of the humanistic principle, the holistic and systemic principle, and the psychological principle. And then around that is the integrative principle. And so I'm going to be looking today at number 2, which is the humanistic principle. And as you can see, it really lies at the base of this model. It's kind of like the foundational piece that enables the practice of transformative coaching to unfold. I'm also going to try to remember to slow down a little bit because I whiz. I'm not sure if that's nerves or just my natural style. I've never quite worked it out. So let's dive into the origins and assumptions of humanistic psychology. So the first thing to say is that until humanistic psychology came along, there are really fundamentally 2 schools of psychology that held sway. There were certainly offshoots that had differences, but the fundamental schools of psychology were the psychodynamic school, which of course was instigated by Freud, Jung, and Adler, and that school of thought. And that was driven by the concept that as human beings, we are riddled, if you like, with unseen forces that drive our behaviors, that are unconscious to us, inaccessible to us, but show themselves in our world in different ways, through behaviors, through dreams, through mistakes, through slips of the tongue. They hint at what's going on, but we have no direct access to them. On the other side was the behaviorist school, which said, no, none of this complex stuff. We are simply organisms that respond to external stimulus and produce a repeatable, predictable response to a given stimulus. And that was, of course, the work of people like Pavlov and Skinner. Those were the two major models of psychology that held sway. However, after the Second World War, there was a real kind of upswing of optimism that led people to start saying, well, how do we look at the best in people? How do we find what's to be hoped for in humanity, rather than just what limits us? In other words, what are these unknown drivers and what are these behaviors that are out of our control? How do we start to look at ourselves as full of potential and richness? And so the first major thinker within this field was Abraham Maslow. Many of you will know Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We'll take a brief look at that during this presentation. But fundamentally, Maslow was instrumental in introducing the very concept of humanistic psychology and also transpersonal psychology, along with Assagioli. And as a result, Maslow could be considered to be the real instigator of the whole humanist movement that we now take for granted. Alongside that, in terms of the application of humanistic psychology, we came Carl Rogers, who of course created what is now known as person-centered therapy, previously client-centered therapy, sometimes synonymous with each other, but fundamentally came up with a concept of therapy that was what we might recognize today as counseling and most forms of psychotherapy that are about putting the client in charge of their journey. There was a fundamental rejection of authority that pervaded the whole humanistic movement, and indeed still does. And in fact, you could say that some of the critique of the humanistic psychology still relates to the fact that it considers itself in some strange way a fringe activity within the psychology world. It often rejects some of the movement to professionalize it, to measure it, to use controlled studies and all that sort of stuff. There's a real kind of tension within the humanistic world around how do we know that this is working. And one of the interesting things is it was predicated on an atheistic approach, generally speaking, but actually the concept of belief is all pervasive through the humanistic psychological world. It's really a belief predicated approach to therapy in a lot of cases. Now, I know there is research that's been done, and much of it has shown that pretty much all therapy is broadly similar in its impact. But from a belief, from a sort of theoretical standpoint, the humanistic psychological backdrop is one of belief rather than evidence. Of course, this led to the human potential movement, which was a major movement that started in the States but spread across the world with encounter groups and growth centers and a whole range of stuff that was really fundamentally about how do we help human beings find themselves, to achieve their potential, to become the acorn that becomes the oak tree, in a sense. That was really the fundamental concept behind it. And as a result, 1960s, 1970s was an absolute flourishing of the humanistic movement, and it was definitely seen as a counterculture move, which in many ways is really positioned it in a certain place in the world today. So that's kind of the backdrop to the history of it. Absolutely fascinating. And you could argue, by the way, that the humanistic psychological approach is merely the fourth of a number of humanistic movements through Western history. And no doubt, if you look at China and India and many other countries and continent civilizations wider than just the West, but if you look at the West, the first major humanistic move would be considered to be ancient Greece, the work of people like Plato and Aristotle, and the real fundamental focus on what is it to be human, and how do humans achieve what Aristotle called eudaimonia, which is the ultimate happiness. And for Aristotle, that was to be a social animal, to be a political animal, to be part of society. And then, of course, the second humanistic movement was essentially the Renaissance. There was a great Renaissance thinker called Pico della Mirandola. And you've got to think that this was at the heart of, hugely religious Europe, just pre-Reformation as well. And at the time, Pico della Mirandola said, man has the capability to be both an angel and a demon. In other words, there's a sense in which we can choose our nature. And of course, you've also got Hamlet, Shakespeare, if you like, through the mouth of Hamlet, saying nothing is either good or bad, but thinking makes it so, which is astounding when you think that he was living at a time of absolute religious turmoil through England. It's incredible that he could say something that's so relativist, that's so morally relativist. So the third movement, of course, was the Enlightenment, and the massive focus on the human being as the center of judgment, if you like. And then the final one would be considered to be the existentialist humanist movement that happened at the end of the 19th century and well into the 20th century, culminating in humanistic psychology. Boom, there you go. That's the history of humanistic psychology. Let's move on. Oh, I nearly forgot Rollo May. Rollo May was an existentialist humanist, very important in actually bridging the gap between the very positive outlook of humanist and humanistic psychology and the existentialist approach to therapy that led on to people like, many of you will have read, people like Irvin Yalom, Rollo May's own therapist. But Rollo May was certainly the real founder of the existentialist humanistic approach. So what are his assumptions? Having established the history of humanistic psychology, what are its basic assumptions? Well, the first thing is the centrality of experience. In other words, that we as humanistic psychologists or coaches or therapists, we consider the client's experience of the world to be the ultimate arbiter of what's true or false for them. You might call that the epistemology. In other words, the epistemology being the theory of knowledge. You could say the theory of knowledge that sits behind the humanistic approach is the centrality of the human experience, the phenomenological approach to understanding truth. Second is they truly believed in the concept of personal agency. And by the way, we'll come back to a lot of these later in terms of the critiques of humanistic psychology. But certainly the notion of personal agency and free will became very dominant as a way of thinking within the humanistic field. It was assumed that all human beings must have personal agency, can take responsibility, and therefore have ownership of their life. And of course, Jean-Paul Sartre said we are condemned to be free, speaking of this concept that freedom brings responsibility to make choice, but nonetheless we have personal agency. Wow, I can't believe it's 1:45 already. Where does the time go? So the next up is the self-actualizing tendency. And you might call this the theory of motivation that sits behind humanistic psychology. Every psychology has fundamentally a number of theories. One is the epistemology, one is the ontology, one is the theory of motivation. The theory of motivation here is a self-actualizing tendency, the natural tendency for an organism to become itself, given the right conditions. The next assumption is the essential okayness and wholeness of people, that if you were to strip away the masks that we wear to survive in society, what Carl Rogers will call the invalidating environment, if we strip away those masks, we are all essentially okay beneath it. And I recently read a lovely description, which was, I can't think who the author was, but he said that the masks we wear are the PR department of our personality, which I thought was a really nice phrase for how we think about this idea of the masks we wear. Another one was the importance of finding the real self. And you'll find this notion of the self, often with a capital S, strewn through humanistic psychology. In fact, I did a talk some years ago called Working with the Self in Coaching. And you can see how much that's predicated on this notion that there is a self, that there is some concept called self. And so you could call that the ontological position. It's the ontology of humanism is that such a thing as a self exists. Whereas if you take a constructivist view, then you might say there isn't a self, there's only the amalgamation of what's constructed socially. Then there's the holistic nature of being. The humanists were keen to bring back the whole body experience, that as a human being, you're not just a walking brain, nor are you just a set of stimuli response triggers. You actually have and indeed as part of the transpersonal movement, they brought in the idea of not just the body, physical, but also the spiritual as a concept that we can connect to, mind, body, spirit. And a phrase you might have come across, the unconditional positive regard. One of the concepts that sits at the heart of humanistic psychology is the idea that as a coach or as a therapist, you have unconditional positive regard for your client. But that's often misunderstood, and I'll come back to that slightly later. But I think it's really important we understand, what do we mean by unconditional positive regard, or as it's often abbreviated, UPR. And then the vitality of the relationship to create conditions of acceptance. The humanistic psychological approach assumes that the relationship itself is vitally important to enable the other human being, call it client, patient, person, whatever, to be seen anew, to be accepted, to find themselves in a place where they can self-actualize away from the invalidating conditions of society. And of course, it's a non-directive approach. The humanistic principle assumes that because of the centrality of experience of the client, that they will find their own direction through whatever challenge they're facing. I'm not sure what the last bullet point is, which means I'm afraid of skipping on too quickly, but let me just see. Okay, good, one more. It's also derived from values which are deemed as overall positive and human. Things like compassion, warmth, growth, love, all those values, what you might call the axiological principle of humanistic psychology, axiology being the study of values. So you've got the epistemology, you've got the theory of motivation, you've got the ontology, and you've got the axiology, which is these values that we would feel to be positive. A behaviorist doesn't care about warmth and love and compassion. A behaviorist cares about what things trigger what behaviors. Simple as that. And how do we create conditions that affect those behaviors more or less positively for the change that somebody wants? So those are the essential assumptions. And by the way, I am recording this and it will go onto YouTube and onto the campus if you're part of Animas. So, there's a lot here, but you can revisit this. So having laid out the assumptions, let's talk about the hierarchy of needs. And I'm not going to go too much into this as a model, but I want to talk about it because of the top one there, which is self-actualization. So I'm sure you will have all come across this. Maslow posited the idea that human beings are essentially progressing through various levels of needs, which get ever more complex and ever more abstract. So at the base, you have the physiological needs, eating, breathing, drinking. Then you move into safety needs, accommodation, shelter. If any of you watched Bear Grylls ever, is it Bear Grylls? Yeah, Bear Grylls. You know he's got some little, I forgot what it is now. He's got this acronym which basically means first you get water, then you get fire, then you get shelter, or something like that. I've forgotten which order it goes in, but it's fundamentally Maslow. And only then, as a human being, do you start to be able to receive and give love and belonging, moving up to esteem, and finally self-actualization. Now, of course, we know it's not as logical as that. It's a simplification, and Maslow never meant it to be some sort of step. Indeed, there's been evidence shown recently that self-actualization helps people achieve some of the lower needs. In other words, if you're in a self-actualizing tendency, you can actually begin to meet some of the lower needs. Say if you're homeless, self-actualization can actually be part of that journey. But broadly speaking, this reflects this notion of the humanistic psychological approach that's all about the individual seeking an ever greater state of meeting their potential. You might almost think about it as almost like a Buddhist concept, where Buddhism tries to reach this kind of nirvana position. This approach is really to do with the individual finding the ultimate realization of their potential. So the reason why I shared this is not to go through this model, but to think about self-actualization, because that's really at the heart of the humanistic psychological approach. I had one of my participants of my supervision course recently did a project on what was missing from positive psychology, and what she said was that because the psychologists who came up with positive psychology were white men in middle-class America, things like safety and very basic physiological needs didn't seem to occur to them as being part of positive psychology. Now, that has been revised slightly since, but it's a really, really good point. If we assume something, it's hard to notice that it's missing for others. So you can find this self-actualization notion becomes the all-dominant theme in some ways within humanism. So what is self-actualization? Quite simply, according to Maslow, to become more and more what one is, to become everything that one is capable of becoming. Now that sounds great, doesn't it? Except for it can lead to some very strange, perverse outcomes. And I think as we start to look through some of the critiques of humanistic psychology, we can see what some of those perverse outcomes are, and how coaching, I think, has to navigate carefully that same balancing act. So let's talk as well about unconditional positive regard. And by then we'll have really laid the foundations for thinking about transformative coaching and some of the critiques that I think we really need to manage as a profession. So what is unconditional positive regard? Well, Carl Rogers defined it as the individual has within him or herself vast resources for self-understanding, for altering her or his self-concept, attitudes, and self-directed behavior. and that these resources can be tapped if only a definable climate of facilitative psychological attitudes can be provided. What does that mean? Well, it means that if we accept that a human being is fundamentally okay and that they have vast resources to grow and change, then we can hold them in unconditional positive regard that enables them to find that place of change. What it doesn't mean, and what is often misunderstood to mean, is that we have unconditional positive regard for their current behaviors. And you'll often hear people say, how can I have unconditional positive regard when they're behaving like that? You're not having regard for their behaviors, you're having regard for their human condition and their ability to change. In other words, if you find yourself in front of a client that you do not believe can change, then your unconditional positive regard doesn't exist. And it might be worth saying, well, am I the right coach for this person? So in many ways, it's incredibly profound, and yet it's also incredibly simple. It's our belief in the ability for a human being to change within themselves, not in terms of what they're currently doing. Final piece I want to talk you through are the 6 conditions, necessary and sufficient conditions for change, that are at the heart of Carl Rogers' work, and indeed at the work of humanistic psychology in general. And fundamentally what Rogers said was, look, people are capable of change by themselves. They self-actualize. If you plonk an acorn in the soil and there's enough space, light, water, air, it's going to, and it's fertilized, it's going to grow into an oak tree. And his point was, we just need to find the same kind of space. We need to create the same kind of conditions for a human being to self-actualize. So what he said was, there are fundamentally 6 things needed for that change to be enabled. And they are, first, that 2 people are in psychological contact. Now that's kind of obvious. It's very hard for me to facilitate change in somebody that's 10,000 miles away. But it's more complex than that, because the question is, what's the quality of that psychological contact? And what's the nature of the relationship that's been evoked through that psychological contact? But nonetheless, the main thing is that there is a psychological contact between people. Next up, that the client desires change, but in some way experiences stuckness. In other words, you can't coach somebody that's not interested in change. You can't do therapy with somebody that's not interested in change. There's got to be a desire for that change to take place, because we're self-actualizing. We're not externally actualized. I remember years ago, I often chuckle at this because it was said in the best way possible, but it was made me laugh. When I said, what are the conditions for an oak tree to become an oak tree? Somebody said it needs somebody to water it. And I thought, how funny that when we think like that, we put ourselves in the power of being the one that creates the change. But of course, the oak tree doesn't need you watering. Guess what? It comes from above. It's called rain. And it's the same experience here. How do we create the conditions for change to take place? So next up is the coach is congruent and authentic in the relationship. As a coach, you need to be authentic. If you find yourself playing the game of being a coach, you are not creating the right conditions for change. Human beings are very clever at sussing out game playing, even if that game playing is for good intent. We know when we're being done to in some way. So it's how do we step into being utterly congruent and authentic as a human being in this relationship? What Martin Buber would call an I-thou relationship. An I-it relationship is a relationship where we are objects to each other. I'm your coach, you're my client. My job is to be your coach, your job is to be my client. An I-thou relationship is one in which 2 human beings come together and accept each other as they are. Next up is the coach experiences unconditional positive regard for their client, and we've talked about what that means. And then the coach experiences and communicates empathic understanding of the client's internal frame of reference. In other words, you as a coach are able to some degree, understand the worldview that the client is coming from, and that to some degree the client receives and feels that empathic understanding and unconditional positive regard. That's it. From a Rogerian perspective, that's all that needs to take place for change to happen. And I don't know if you've ever heard of the lamppost concept, but that's one step further back again. But there was a coach, I think it was Michael Neal, who said that if all somebody does is walk up to a lamppost and talk to that lamppost every day, they will get better just through sheer being able to vocalize what's going on for them. But hopefully we're a bit better than a lamppost. And the last bit in the foundational stuff around humanistic psychology is the function of the relationship. And the function of the relationship is A, to create the empathy that enables trust and acceptance, B, to enable the client to see themselves anew through that relationship. This is that bit where, as a coach, you reflect back something that you hear, something that you notice in the body language, some facial expression, some blush, some crinkling of the brow. They see themselves anew through your reflection, and at the same time through the fact that they're starting to talk about themselves without being judged. That dialogue itself facilitates change through awareness and acceptance, and that the coach and client are both essential to the relational quality. In other words, it's not a case of, well, I'm a coach, you're a coach, she's a coach, he's a coach, we're all coaches, it doesn't matter who that person picks. No, you are an essential ingredient of that relationship. You bring your uniqueness to it. You are utterly important in that unique configuration of two human beings. Whew, great. So we've looked at the history of humanistic psychology. We've looked at the essential assumptions that lie behind it. Let's talk about what that means for transformative coaching and why it feels so important to me that this is at the heart of it, and yet some of the caveats I think we need to have around it. So the first thing is, in transformative coaching, we accept the power of dialogue and personal inquiry. If you think about it, coaching is predicated on dialogue. That's what it is. It's a dyad of dyad of people talking about one person. Simple as that. There's a lot of nuance to it in terms of we don't direct and all this kind of stuff, but fundamentally it's dialogue and personal inquiry. What's happening here for me? It's not a chat. It's not a conversation about politics. And when you notice that happening in coaching, or you notice yourself beginning to collude because you think you're on the same page about something, you're no longer doing personal inquiry. There's an acceptance of the notion of unconditional positive regard within transformative coaching. It assumes that we can change. It assumes that no human being is bad in their essence. No human being is good in their essence. And it's funny when you hear somebody talking about, I don't know if you know this story, but I had a bit of a hissy fit a couple of years ago on the boat when one of my team was writing an event and it said, the wonderful so-and-so. And I said, they're not wonderful. They might have parts of them that are wonderful sometimes, but other parts that are really annoying other times. The minute we as a coaching school say the wonderful something, we objectify them, we simplify them, we strip away all of their complexity, and we turn them into something that's pleasing us to believe they are. And to my mind, that is not unconditional positive regard. That is objectifying and labeling in order to feel good about who we're dealing with. And I actually wanted to do a whole dialogue. I think we actually did do a whole dialogue on it, but then we didn't publish it because it felt a bit like, this is just nitpicking and navel gazing, which I can definitely understand why they might have felt that. But I think it's really important when we say the wonderful John, the wonderful Miriam, the wonderful whoever, we are objectifying and simplifying and stripping all of their complexity. And it might seem a bit over the top, but I really believe that. So next up is the centrality of the client's experience. That's absolutely critical. We've already seen it's at the heart of our model, the phenomenological principle. The client's experience trumps everything else. Doesn't matter what some great thinker said. Doesn't matter what I think as a coach. What's that client feeling? What's their experience? How are they finding the world? And then, of course, the belief in growth and the trust in the client to move towards growth. And one of the things I've noticed in the coaching world is the tendency for the coach to want to become more central than they really are. In other words, somehow they want to be more important to that client's growth. And they kind of think that they have to be intrinsic to that growth instead of trusting that given the space, growth is going to happen. The number of times when people say to me things like, how do you know that coaching has worked? It's like, you don't know the coaching has worked and you don't know when it's going to work. Sometimes you do because it's a very clear contract. It's a very clear area of work. But other times that growth can take years. And as Irvin Yalom says, every contact leaves a trace. Some of you might have seen, I did an interview recently with a chap called Rajiv Arora, who I coached years ago. And he wanted to do some amazing transformational work. And years later, he's now opening a retreat in Nepal. He was a really successful banker. And now he's opening a retreat in Nepal. That took years to get to. And when I said that to him, I think he thought I was criticizing him, but I wasn't. I was reflecting on We don't know when the change is going to happen, but we as coaches need to trust the process, that change will unfold as it needs to. If the client wants it, if the client really connects to it, they will self-actualize, don't you worry. They're an acorn and you put them in the soil and they're all good. And then finally, I think it's finally, the holistic nature of the person we take for granted, hence why we have the holistic principle as part of our model. We see that human beings are more than just a walking brain on a stick. They're a body, their emotions, their creativity, their spirit, their spiritual, they're all these things that make them who they are. And that's all been taken from the humanistic psychological perspective. Now, what transformative coaching brings that I think is lacking in the humanistic field is a focus on the mental paradigms that derive from a more constructivist theory. What do I mean by that? Well, the constructivist theory assumes that we are constantly construing the world in particular ways that then govern our behavior in the world. So the humanistic principle doesn't look at that. It doesn't mean it rejects it. It just isn't a core part of its way of thinking. Whereas the transformative approach is to say, well, what is the model of the world that you're operating from? What is the paradigm? What is the belief structure that you've got as a jigsaw in your mind and your body that is shaping your experience of the world? And that's the bit that transformative coaching in particular, not all coaching, but transformative coaching in particular, begins to draw out. How are we construing the world in ways that constrain us and propel us in different ways? Everyone see my screen still? Let's go for the danger of wholesale introjection. So introjection is a term that means I think it comes from Gestalt, but it certainly comes from a humanistic psychology. But wholesale introjection is the idea that you eat something whole and you don't digest it, you just take it in and it becomes a belief that's been introjected. You would probably have covered this if you ever looked at the A to F model of belief change, that we introject the belief and we need to actually almost regurgitate it to re-inspect it. That sounds really unpleasant, doesn't it? But that's really what we're looking at. Now, here are the dangers that I see. I perceive that the humanistic psychological model of coaching has become more and more dominant over the last few years. And it's led to a rejection of the positivist, cognitive, and logical dimensions of coaching that I believe used to be so important. I think that the humanistic psychological approach to coaching wasn't always the heart of coaching, but it's become more so. There were certain aspects to it, certain assumptions that were always at the heart of coaching, but I would say that the values of humanistic psychology have become ever more dominant, and it's meant that coaches who coach from a more logical perspective or a cognitive perspective sometimes feel left out in the cold of this much more emotionally oriented world of humanistic psychology, and that is a concern for me. I think I've had conversations recently where coaches feel they're not able to be fully themselves because somehow they feel they're too logical. And by the way, can I just ask you, if you're not on mute, just to mute yourselves, because I'm aware sometimes it pops over to your face and you suddenly find yourself on YouTube by accident. Next up is an overemphasis on the relationship in coaching. Look, I might be wrong on this, but I think that there's been an increasing turn towards the idea of the relationship in coaching. Part of that is from the work of Eric DeHaan and the Ashridge school. And I think it's fantastic. I absolutely love, Eric DeHaan is one of my favorite writers in coaching, but I do think that the relationship between a coach and a client isn't as important as we like to think it is. And I do worry that we're trying to position ourselves as more important in that relationship than we really are. We have an important role to play as an individual. In other words, I'm not a coaching process. I am a human being. But I also think that the relationship is becoming ever more central to coaching, because that's where it started in therapy. The relationship was seen to be the crucible of healing within therapy. And I think what's happening is the relationship has taken the same journey towards being the crucible of change in coaching. And I don't think that it has to be. Doesn't mean it can't be. I'm just a little bit worried about, personally, that overemphasis on the relationship. And the final thing I would say is I feel there's a risk of the subtle imposition of humanistic values into coaching that begin to make coaching feel less neutral, less about the human being, and more about what I talked about at the start, the axiological perspective of the humanistic psychological world around those particular values of compassion and warmth and love and these sorts of things. And sometimes when we get a client that doesn't fit that, we want to label them as somehow different. They're a narcissist, or they're that, you know, or whatever language you choose to use, it doesn't fit our humanistic values, and so therefore they become an other. And indeed, one of the big critiques of the humanistic world is this focus on self and other. R.D. Laing, classic existential psychotherapist, was very much into this notion of the self and the other. And when we start to make something the other, we will always find the differences in the other. So those are my kind of concerns with the wholesale introjection of the humanistic approach. But that doesn't wipe away any of the amazing stuff it gives us. So let me talk now about the critiques of the humanistic tradition in a more general sense. And just let me grab a drink of water. Hold on one second. It gives your ears a chance to breathe when I take a little drink of water. So critiques of humanistic tradition, and there are quite a lot, and I think they're really, really worth looking at. And they come from both me, my own thinking about this, and from a wider spectrum of thinkers, both within the humanistic world and outside of. So the first thing is there's a lack of clarity, and its essential basis is one of beliefs. There isn't a lot of hardcore research into the notions that will back up unconditional positive regard. The self-actualizing tendency is often severely tested. The notion of essential okayness doesn't often stand up to scrutiny. There's a lot that would make you question the humanistic notions. That doesn't mean they can't add value to how we think about them. They can be an assumption, but whether they're a truth is another issue. And I think sometimes it's laid in as though it's a truth. This particular critique is not one of mine. I mean, I do agree with it, but it's one that's leveled at it quite frequently. There's a lack of real evidence around the humanistic notions. Secondly, there is even in the word itself, humanistic tradition, there is the supremacy of humans at the center of this. And I'll tell a silly little story here, but I think it was kind of interesting. My wife cooked some, we're mainly vegetarian, but not fully. And she cooked some paella thing the other day, and a pea fell out of my bowl onto the mat. And I looked at it and I was like, that pea, never thought it was going to end up on my mat, nearly eaten by me. And then my wife said, oh, don't let that little pea go to waste. And I said, I joked that this pea thought it made the great escape. And she said, yeah, but it was going to end up in the bin. I said, yeah, but it didn't know it was going to end up in the bin. That little pea thought it made the great run for escape. And I suddenly was struck by the enormous importance we give to human beings and human death and human life. Everything dies, but we give this enormous importance to human death. And yet that little pea never lived its full self-actualized life. And it might sound very silly that I'm saying this, but I do worry that the humanistic tradition overprivileges the species of human against all others. And again, in many ways, that's led to the critique that it's backed up the dominance of us as a species, and therefore everything that it's led to in terms of climate change and so on. Next, about overprivileges personal agency. What do I mean by that? Well, increasingly, I think we're becoming aware of the fact that yes, we have personal agency, but we are situated in systems that constrain us. I used to call this, before I sort of delved into the humanistic psychological world, I noticed this, and I called it personal development fascism, because there was this kind of thing where if you didn't achieve something, it's you. If you don't like something, it's you. If I've done something wrong and you don't like it, it's you. There was this kind of real attempt to make everything a unis because of personal agency. You've got personal agency, you get on and deal with it. The problem is we're part of systems. We are evolved as organisms within societies and communities and civilizations and bioculture and all kinds of stuff. That means we're not some vacuum-packed personal agent. We exist within a wider set of forces. And if we don't recognize that, then we have the risk of imposing a level of personal agency that's not actually realistic for a person to take on. And I think that can be a real challenge. Next up is the focus on the self and the needs of the individual. One of the big critiques of humanistic tradition is this idea of it's rather self-centered. And there was a classic poem by Fritz Perls, one of the founding members of Gestalt therapy. And I won't repeat it because I've forgotten it, but it broadly says, I'm me, you're you. If our paths might cross, that's great. But if they don't, it's not my problem. Something like that. Look it up. And it's not an aggressive poem, but it is utterly about the self is all that matters here. You're you, I'm me, that's fine. We don't need to connect. And we can connect, but if we don't, it's not a big deal. So there's been a real focus on the self and the individual and the needs of the individual. I think there's also, this is one of my challenges to the humanistic psychological world, is there's a certain moral superiority that's a shadow to this way of thinking. And I want to read you a very brief sentence from one of the early humanist psychologists called Dina Glauberman. And she said that in the early days of humanistic psychology, and this was her words, we were on the side of the political angels. Well, if you're on the side of the political angels, it assumes there's a political set of demons. There's this moral superiority that's really at risk of showing itself up in the work we do as coaches, therapists, and as people who influence the field of the work we do. And the helping professions are very much influenced by humanistic psychology. And it does concern me sometimes. There's a creeping moral superiority that comes into ways of thinking about what's good and what's bad, despite the fact that we are theoretically non-judgmental. Then there's the poeticization of life. And let me read you another little quote. This is from Schneider, I believe. Let me take a look. Here we are. Yeah, Schneider describes psychology, but in particular, his view was that all psychology deals with this fundamental challenge. The main problem of the human being is the paradoxical problem that we are both angels and food for worms, that we are suspended between constrictive and expansive worlds, and that we are both exhilarated and stupefied by the tension. Beautiful. Nobody can deny that. Sounds great. It sounds so amazing. Like, wow, so profound. But is that how we really experience life? Do we really feel exhilarated and stupefied? I think most of us feel like we're facing the humdrumness of life. We're trying to figure out what Jean-Paul Sartre would call how we overcome ennui, existential boredom. We're not exhilarated. We're not stupefied. It's far too extreme. I do think humanistic psychology loves to poeticize the human experience. And the problem is the thinkers who do that are operating in a very rarefied atmosphere where all they do is talk to each other a lot of the time, and they're not necessarily connecting to the real life of people who are just going like, I don't think I want this job. It's why that so often coaching is looked down upon in some parts of the therapy world. I was reading a book today where one of the humanistic psychologists talked about CBT as the CBT people. Like there are different species, the CBD people. Like what? You know, self and other, separating. I think the more we start to recognize that we are all in this together as humans and we're going through challenges, but it's not as dramatic, it's not as Nietzschean. Who is that famous painter, the German painter who would, I can't think of his name now, but he would do that. He was a romantic painter and everything was dramatic. That's not how I think most of us experience life. And that's a real concern. I've talked about this one already. There's a real critique that there's a focus on the dualist notion of self and other. And that's not to say that you have to be a monist and only believe in the oneness of everything, but there's a real sense in which the humanist psychology is constantly separating the self from the other. And that's part of the language structure of that world. Then there's a sense in which, by the way, sorry, humanistic psychology, I really actually like you. I just want to point out some of the challenges that we need to face as a profession if we're going to really thrive. So the next one is that humanistic psychology is often taken a very detached, critical perspective on normal life, on politics, on society. It has a sort of a looking at rather than being part of, that means that it can be very detached from the experience of what it is to confront the dirtiness of life. I remember a line from a Bruce Springsteen song, which he says, what is it? What's the phrase? No one gets out of here without their shirt tails a little muddy. You know, that's the truth of life. We're all muddy in some way, but it's very easy to stand apart from it and criticize it as though you have a solution when you're not part of that solution. This is one of the big critiques of it, is that it risks perpetuating existing systems through the focus on personal responsibility. Hey, there's racism, no problem, deal with it. Hey, there's sexism, no problem, deal with it. Hey, deal with it. Hey, deal with it. Personal responsibility. By the way, I hold that as a strong view, that as an individual human being, we have personal responsibility for how do we deal with our existing environment. I'm not going to wait for somebody else to deal with it, but that doesn't mean it doesn't need to be dealt with. And there's a real risk that this focus on personal responsibility and growth means that we are at risk perpetuating a certain societal perspective. Next up is that my experience of it is it seems to be determined to be a bulwark against the damaging world. In other words, poor human being, they would self-actualize if only they were given the right conditions. But the conditions are bad. But we can't see that they're getting better, because if they do, we're out of a job. Our psychological perspective on the world is out of whack. And yet, across many parts of the world, a lot of the things that were seriously problematic for human beings is getting better. But you wouldn't know it to read a lot of humanistic psychology. You would think that we're getting worse and worse and worse as a world. And then finally, there's what you might call the over-focus on growth. And James Hillman, the Jungian analyst, talked about the idea that growth is part of a natural cycle. Things grow in spring, but they die off in winter. But the humanistic psychological approach is about growth, 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 growth. And even behind me, you'll see my Peloton. It's like, Nick, you're 52 years old. Why are you jumping on a Peloton every day? Stop trying to grow. I can't help it. But it's true. It's like we have got this obsession with the idea of constantly getting better. And that comes from the humanistic approach. So finally, I want to wrap up with the last 10 minutes. My hopes for the humanistic approach. Number one, I hope that we be non-judgmental to those who fall outside our scope of easy non-judgment. I find it way too common to experience non-judgmental people being judgmental to people they don't like, and non-judgmental to people they do. Hey, that's not difficult. You know, I'm actually amazed by the bifurcation in our world as coaches and therapists when it comes to certain things like Brexit and Trump. The polarization is immediate. And yet what happened to this essential okayness? What happened to the ability to recognize projection when we see it? What happened to non-judgment? Whoa, no. We don't need to worry about those things when it's Trump or Brexit or anything else that we choose to go like bang, 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 bang. That worries me. That really worries me, because it feels like what it's really saying is non-judgment's only for those we don't judge. Next up is that we can respect people's ability to respond as an individual without diminishing the importance of the collective. My wife is Chinese, and I've learned over the last 3 years, going through COVID with her, the difference between a collective mentality, which China would represent, and a Western mentality. It was staggering to me how different we thought about freedom, personal responsibility. And it really brought home to me the cultural implications of the Western ideas of individual freedom versus collectivist approach. And it's not that one's good or bad, but let's be more aware of them within a humanist context. Next up, that we can trust people to be robust enough to recognize the truth without having to soften truth's blow. I do feel like there's a lot of softening of the blow. And I came across the phrase recently, which I loved. I just love it. It's just so pure. And it's, the truth will set you free, but first it'll punch you in the face. And I think that's absolutely true in so many cases. But I think we have to be willing to be punched in the face in order to face the truth. And I do sometimes worry that there's a softening and a softening and a softening that's coming with this psychological humanistic approach. I would like to think that our belief in people's okayness is granted to all, not just to those we think are okay. And that goes back to my first one. There's a real sense in which some people aren't okay and they can never be okay, and some people are. And I won't go into some of the stuff I've seen because we don't have time, but I really think that as coaches in particular, therapy is not my world. That's for them to figure out. But for coaches in particular, I think we really need to take time to say, to what extent am I judging somebody's okayness without admitting that's what I'm doing? And next up, that the optimism espoused in humanistic psychology is then reflected in how we as change makers face our challenges together, not hubristically, as in, you know, we can solve the world, but realistically with a sense of this is actually what's happening. I remember I read a post recently on LinkedIn about it was somebody doing a project, and they said, whilst the billionaires play with their little rockets, that was literally the language, very patronizing. I'm like, play with the little rockets. We don't know what Elon Musk might be doing for our future as a civilization. We don't know. Let Elon Musk do his thing while you do yours. But instead, we have to immediately squash that in order to raise ourselves up. That bothers me in coaching. This was from the head of a coaching association. And I think that believing in dialogue allows for true communication instead of process-driven pattern of interaction. In other words, too often in coaching, I see people following the coaching rules rather than being in true dialogue. I believe as coaches, particularly transformative coaches, we can be in true dialogue with people and still respect the underlying principles of coaching without following a pattern of communication that feels stilted and fake. And finally, that coaching will continue to benefit from the richness and flexibility of its practice without the risk of over-professionalization. And just as Carl Rogers hoped, he was anti-professionalization. I hope that even as the ICF become more and more mature, and I think the ICF have become very mature recently, I hope we can avoid becoming over-professionalized. I think that's really important. And finally, I want to finish off by celebrating. I want to celebrate our belief in essential okayness. I want to celebrate our belief in the individual's ability to make a difference to their own lives and to the lives of others. I want to celebrate our belief in our capacity to grow and change. I want to celebrate our belief in dialogue. And finally, I want to celebrate our desire to focus on happiness. I think these are all beautiful, beautiful remnants. And let's say not remnants because that implies it's gone, but they're beautiful flowerings of the humanistic psychological world. So on that note, I'm going to finish my presentation and thank you very much, and just take a few questions if there are.